Jonathan, welcome back into the back room.
Thank you. Nice to see you, Andy.
Likewise. So today is your 10th anniversary at the Anti-Defamation League. Congratulations.
You wouldn't know this. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
So much has changed in America since then. How have the changes of the past decade impacted you and the work of the ADL?
Well, yeah, so let's step back, right? ADL has been at this work for an awfully long time, right? We are the oldest anti-hate organization in the country. We've been fighting the good fight for over 112 years. And yet at the same time, I think there's really never been a period of such volatility and such change as the last decade. I mean, in the last decade, we saw the sort of unprecedented election of Donald Trump and all that augured for American political life, let alone for the world. We saw the COVID-19 crisis, which literally changed our society in so many ways. I think we're still recovering from it. We've seen the extraordinary rise of AI and the transformative effect it's having on so many segments of our public life. And against this backdrop, we've also seen an unprecedented rise in anti-Semitism, extremism, and hate in general. So for us at ADL, for me as the CEO, it has been an incredibly interesting and at the same time incredibly sort of anxiety-filled ride. I mean, we saw after years and years, Andy, of anti-Semitic incidents in the United States hovering between 700 and 900 a year. Last year, we recorded more than 9,000. Last year was the 5th time in 6 years we've broken a new record. Is remarkable. In the last 10 years, we've seen intense anti-Semitic attitudes as a percent of the population more than double in the US and reach historic levels around the world. And of course, I think it's safe to say that the war in Gaza triggered on October the 7th sort of a tsunami of hate in ways no one would have guessed that the largest massacre of Jews, the most bloody incident since the Holocaust, would actually spawn not sort of, if you will, empathy, but antipathy, right? It was followed by a wave of hate that we're still struggling with. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of a media landscape. I mean, we're here on the podcast today. Like podcasts have exploded. The media landscape has totally fragmented. Social media now is the number one way that I think society gets its news. So wow, an awful lot of change, Andy, in a very short amount of time.
Well, you've mentioned a lot of very important things there, and I want to get to them shortly. But when you look ahead, what do you envision the next 10 years will be like?
That's a good question. So number one, I think, whereas COVID-19 has faded as one of the trends I talked about, I think some of the things that it fueled, cynicism, distrust, a kind of, it's almost like paradoxical, shared sense of alienation. Some of that is here to stay. And unless we have leaders who are promoting a kind of healing, I think you're going to continue to see this sort of polarization is the only word for it. We see it in our politics. We've got Trump on one side and Mamdani on the other. They represent the two poles in many ways. So I think you're going to see more distrust. You're going to see more kind of volatility in that sense and more polarization, number one. I think number two, this will continue to be animated by artificial intelligence. I think, as someone who worked in technology for many years, I was sort of part of both the first wave of the internet and then the second wave with two different startups that both got very big. I think artificial general intelligence is coming. And so we're going to live in a moment where, if you think about it, 30 years ago, the internet was not the thing that it is today. And yet we've seen the pace of change accelerate and the interval shorten and shorten. So we're going to get to a point where artificial general intelligence means that we're living in an entirely connected world. And the kind of things we just take for granted today are going to be, we don't see today, sorry, are going to be taken for granted. And in that world where there's more intelligence in our machines than there are in people, that's going to beget all kinds of complexity. And then thirdly, I think maybe the most interesting thing will be how the world responds in terms of anti-Semitism, at least from where I sit. Because I think we're on the cusp of historic change in the Middle East. I think an end to the Gaza war is coming. I think there'll be on the horizon some political process for the Palestinian people that should allow the state of Israel to work out and really literally finally end the Arab-Israeli conflict. Saudi Arabia, it's coming. Kuwait is coming. Syria could, again, despite what's happened in the last week, I think a non-belligerence pact and then normalization could happen. Same with Lebanon. So when the Arab-Israeli crisis is over, that begets lots of possibilities for the Jewish state that, again, I think will redound in positive ways for Jews living in diaspora. I certainly hope so.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned Donald Trump a couple of times, and yes, he emerged on the national political stage in 2015 as well. And many people believe it's no coincidence that the rise in overall anti-Semitic rhetoric and hate crimes has spiked during this period, given his own rhetoric and policies. Do you draw that same parallel?
Well, there's certainly no question, Andy, that if we look at, again, I was sort of alluding to it before, anti-Semitic incidents were bouncing around in the same range for decades. Things changed in 2016. We saw a 34% year-over-year increase in acts of harassment, vandalism, and violence. And we saw, let's say, a correlative impact in Donald Trump's campaign events and then a rise in hate incidents, hate crimes and bias incidents. Like, we statistically tracked this. We weren't inventing it. And we saw really in the second half of 2016, tied to the general election, we saw an extraordinary rise of sort of white supremacist activity. Let's call it far-right activity. Now, along the way, as a candidate, things like pretending not to know who David Duke was when he certainly knew who he was, using language that, like America First, that was a allusion to Charles Lindbergh's America First kind of foreign policy idea when he wanted to keep, he was pro-Nazi, he wanted to keep America out of the Second World War. Bring on people like Steve Bannon, who readily employ anti-Semitic rhetoric. We saw all these things happen. And then on election day, after President Trump won in 2016, we saw a massive spike, literally on election day and the day after and the day after. So there's no doubt in my mind that he used a kind of rhetoric that emboldened extremists, and he welcomed them into the fold in ways that just hadn't happened before. I mean, he was doing like Alex Jones's podcast and other things that, again, normalized the abnormal. Now, at the same time, let's acknowledge he came to office with a Jewish son-in-law and a Jewish daughter. That had never happened before. He had Jewish grandchildren inside the residence. That had never happened before. And then he proceeded to do things. He proceeded with policies that, like his executive order in 2019 on anti-Semitism, that were precedent-making. So there's just no doubt that he used intemperate rhetoric and he emboldened extremists. And I just think about all the memes we saw on social media during his run, the Hillary with the Jewish star, again and again and again. And yet at the same time, he embraced a set of policies that were also positive. So there's a real, what's the word for it? I mean, it's a bit of a conundrum. It's just not as simple and cut and dried as some people might like to say. So that's what we saw. By the way, I should also note that we saw a rise in anti-Black hate crimes, in xenophobic actions against people who were perceived to be Mexican or Latino. And everyone knows, or I think everyone remembers, the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes that happened after COVID-19, when people in the White House referred to that pandemic as the China virus or Kung flu or other terrible things. And that put like a target on the back of people who were sort of observably Asian American. And we saw horrible things happen, including assaults and murders. So there's no doubt that Donald Trump's campaign, whether he intended or not, changed the kind of dynamic in ways we're still reeling from. And at the same time, again, he embraced some other policies that, in respect to the Jewish community, were very positive. That's simply true.
So if we look at just the last several months alone, we've witnessed the arson attack on Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro's home.
Yeah.
We saw the murder of 2 employees of the Israeli embassy in D.C. and the horrific terror attack in Boulder, Colorado. In all of these incidences, officials said the attackers claimed to be defending Palestinians. These anti-Semitic attacks, they're getting more brazen, more violent, more shocking. That just seems to be a worsening situation.
It is. I mean, you're entirely correct. I mean, from 2016, let's say 2017 to 2021, we saw a series of shocking events. Charlottesville, where a woman was run down and killed by a white supremacist. Pittsburgh, where 11 people were shot down in a synagogue on a Saturday morning by a white supremacist. Poway, where a person was shot and killed, a congregant at a Chabad congregation outside of San Diego by a white supremacist. And yet, then also in 2019, we had 3 Jewish people killed in a kosher supermarket by a Black Hebrew Israelite. We had a rabbi stabbed to death in his home by someone who seemed to be anti-Zionist. We had an Al-Qaeda enthusiast take hostages in 2021 at a synagogue outside Dallas and Colleyville. And then in the last 6 months, the arson attack on the home of the governor of Pennsylvania, again, by a person who said he opposed his policies on the Middle East, which makes no sense because he's the governor of Pennsylvania. He doesn't have policies on the Middle East. By the way, it's worth noting, a year earlier, when Governor Shapiro was in contention to be the next vice president nominee for the Democratic Party, he was slandered as Genocide Josh. Now, keep in mind, Genocide Josh, he had the same policies, quote unquote, as did all the other candidates who were in contention for the vice president. But only the Jewish person was, harassed and maligned in this way. And then, of course, the shooting outside the Capitol Jewish Museum, where a young couple was gunned down in the back, the assailant fired 20 rounds at these people. And the firebombing in Boulder. I think all of these are so grotesque because, as you sort of referenced at the top, the killers, the culprits, all claimed that they were doing this to, quote, free Palestine or save Gaza. And what a fiction that is. Because, again, like firebombing an elderly Jewish woman has nothing to do with saving a single Palestinian. And holding all Jews collectively responsible, whether they are, again, coming out of a museum or sleeping in the governor's mansion, holding them responsible for what you don't like on the other side of the world, that's anti-Semitism. But I think what's so really horrendous about this is not just how brazen these attacks are, Andy. If I compare this to the first round of attacks I mentioned earlier, everyone spoke out. Now, 5, 6, 7 years later, the condemnation is muted. And certain people on the political spectrum literally don't say anything about it. And when you press them, they say, well, it's complicated. Well, it's difficult. Well, I understand that they're frustrated. And look, as far as I'm concerned, cold-blooded murder is not a political strategy. It is not an acceptable form of discourse. And why this escapes some people's kind of moral calculus, I think it's astonishing and inexcusable. I really do. And so again, anti-Semitism sort of bookends these last 10 years for me. Horrific attacks coming from the far right, horrific attacks coming from the radical left, each side making excuses. But where we are today, when half the country won't even decry it, I think that's really quite quite shocking and inexcusable.
So let's talk about Israel. I'm a supporter and historically a big defender of Israel. I know you're a supporter and defender of Israel. There's a lot of things I'm seeing that I'm really struggling with. So I want to ask you, when you think about that, Axios this morning reported that many in the Trump White House are referring to Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu as a, quote, madman. Are you critical at all of any of the actions taken by the Netanyahu government in Gaza, in Syria?
I mean, so first of all, I would just say up front, I am absolutely a ferocious and unapologetic Zionist. That means I believe in the Jewish people to the right to self-determination in their homeland. It's a liberation movement. I am super proud uh, and unafraid to say that. And that shouldn't be politically controversial or anything of the sort, in my opinion. Now, that being said, the Israeli government is in power. I don't always agree with what they do. And it's on a range of issues. Now, so with that in mind, the complexities of prosecuting the war in Gaza, look, I want those hostages to come home. If the hostages came home today, I think all the fighting would end like that. Like that. And the Israelis time and again have put forward proposals that Hamas has rejected, or Hamas has suggested they would accept only with major changes that basically invalidate the proposals. I was at the Aspen Security Forum last week, and Brett McGurk, the former Biden White House official who handled the Middle East portfolio for the NSC, and he was saying, let's remember what's actually happened here. Israel's put together multiple efforts to end the war, and Hamas has rejected them and rejected them and rejected them. I would also say that an aid process controlled by Hamas is an aid process that's bound to fail. So I appreciate what the US and Israel is trying to do with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. And yet, the war has to end. We need these hostages to come home. And what we really need to do, in my opinion, is to lean on Qatar, which has the most control over Hamas, push Saudi and Turkey and other countries that have control over Hamas or influence over Hamas to get them to release the hostages. That would just end this right away. And so I appreciate that much of the global condemnation is being directed at Israel, because we're seeing people killed at these aid stations. And immediately, of course, the Hamas health ministry blames Israel and the press corps blames Israel. But it seems, and again, I cannot excuse actions that I don't understand, that I literally don't, it's hard for me to ascertain why they're doing certain things. But I do know, Andy, that the path to ending this war, it runs through Doha. The world should be leaning on Qatar. The United States should be leaning on Qatar to compel Hamas to end this once and for all.
But you alluded before, or suggested before, that there is connective tissue to the rise in anti-Semitism and hate crimes and what's happening in the Middle East. And so I want to be very specific. For certain Trump administration officials to be suggesting that Netanyahu is a madman, is there any part of what they're doing, what he's doing, that you believe is just simply going too far?
Look, my focus every day here in my job at ADL, Andy, is to protect the Jewish people, to stop the defamation of the Jewish people, and to secure just fair treatment to all. So I'm focused on fighting violence, vandalism, and harassment of Jews in America, and to a degree around the world. I'm not a foreign policy expert, nor am I a military expert. I want, though, this war to end. I want the hostages to come home. I don't want a single additional person killed, Israeli, Palestinian, anyone in between. And in the fog of war, it shouldn't surprise us that mistakes get made. The bombing of a church in Gaza is reprehensible. Now, we know that Hamas weaponizes mosques, builds tunnels under them, stores munitions in them, hides hostages in them. But using houses of worship, seeing houses of worship exposed to, violence is just deplorable. So I want this to end. I want the hostages to come home. I think in order to make that happen, Hamas needs to finally capitulate. And then the Israelis won't have a reason to keep fighting. But I should say something else. You asked, and I want to make sure I answer the question. We have seen for many years that violence in the Middle East or incidents in the other side of the world can trigger spasms of anti-Semitism here at home. We certainly see that. So we've seen that for decades. But what's different today, what feels consequentially different, is that again, after October the 7th, before a single Israeli soldier was in Gaza, I shouldn't say that, they were hostages, right? They pulled these people across the border. They took corpses across the border. After that savagery, we saw anti-Semitic incidents here. We saw people rationalizing it. We saw people claiming Israel was committing genocide before they had fired a shot. So that was different. And what I would say to you is that what we're seeing today that feels very different is an effort by, I don't want to call them activists because that's giving them too much credit, Andy. Let's call it an organized campaign by agitators who are trying to exploit the violence in the Middle East as a pretext to drive kind of a wedge between the Jewish community and the rest of society here, holding all Jews responsible for what's happening over there. Again, going after Jewish people on college campus, Jewish students on college campuses, going after Jewish professionals in different, work environments and so on. So I think one thing that feels qualitatively different is a small group of people who feel emboldened, who are using the chaos of this moment as cover to drive their sort of ideological campaign to marginalize Jewish people, to sort of delegitimize Jewish organizations. I see that happening. We're tracking it, and it's incredibly troubling.
Yeah, well, to put a punctuation on this particular subject, and I can only obviously speak for myself, but I thought I'd never hear myself say this, but on this particular issue, I got to say I'm agreeing with those in the Trump administration who say he's a madman, because I think he's a madman. I think he's playing with fire, and unfortunately, for all the reasons we've been discussing, I think he's making a lot of American Jews like me, who were completely on the side of Israel for so many years, question a lot of things and making us really frustrated.
Look, I think that's, Andy, that's reasonable. I mean, look, I'm on the side of America too, but I question openly decisions coming out of the White House from
Sure.
Republican and Democratic administrations. I feel like I'm on the side of the UK. I love London. It's one of my favorite cities in the world. I could not understand Brexit. I struggled with why they would do this. So we can have a love of the state of Israel. We can appreciate all that it brings. And yet we can have profound disagreements with the leadership. Like, that's super normal as far as I'm concerned. I think
No, look, I say that all the time. I say that I hope our friends overseas don't judge America today by Donald Trump. I mean,
Yeah.
and so I look at Israel or any other country through the same lens. But
Right.
but the facts on the ground are what they are, and unfortunately, we have to live with that. And as you mentioned
agree.
earlier, which I agree with, so much of this is all rolled up in the same ball. And I just don't know where it goes. But let's shift here. You wrote an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal last week about a measure that was recently adopted by the National Education Association pertaining to ADL educational materials in K through 12 classrooms, and specifically about a move to end its partnership with your organization. An update to that is that on Friday, the NEA Executive Committee voted to reject that proposal, thankfully. Speak to this overall situation.
Sure. So stepping back, one of the most, I think, important things that we do at ADL in our effort to fight hate is not just monitor extremists, is not just deal with hate crimes, but we also try to win hearts and minds. And we do that through education. We're doing that for generations. So we're one of the largest providers in the country of anti-bias, anti-hate content in schools. We have programs that teach about the Holocaust and genocide more broadly. We have programs that teach about anti-Semitism and other forms of hate. We have anti-bullying programs and so on and so forth. Last year alone, in academic year 24, we reached over 4.5 million school children. I mean, it's a pretty consequential footprint. Now, yes, at the National Education Association, which is the largest teachers union in the country, their national assembly a few weeks ago was held in Portland, Oregon, and a small group, again, let's call them agitators, proposed a new business item to, quote, boycott the ADL. Now, what's interesting about that is there are sure lots of NEA teachers in thousands upon thousands upon thousands of classrooms who use ADL materials. But they do so, Andy, without a formal sort of partnership with the NEA. We're just a provider. Yet these folks stepped in and said, we want to boycott the ADL. So again, they wanted to boycott us from a partnership that we don't actually have with their organization, which really shows you the level of depravity here. These activists come after ADL. Why? Not because our peer-reviewed content, they didn't find flaws in it. They couldn't sort of say that we don't agree with the pedagogy. They couldn't spell out, we think the curriculum gets this and that wrong. They went after us because we're a Jewish organization. They went after us because we're a Zionist organization. They went after us because we fight anti-Semitism in an unapologetic way, and that they can't handle. So this item was kicked up to the executive committee because it was a boycott, and the executive committee decides on boycotts. The executive committee unanimously rejected it, and I'm grateful for the leadership of NEA CEO Becky Pringle, who stamped this down, as well as others. But I do have to tell you, this was unprecedented. Again, this was a ban, prima facie, because we're a Jewish organization. Nothing more, nothing less. They question our content. They question our materials, not because of the content, but simply because of the organization behind it. An organization that's been committed to fighting hate since before any of these activists were even born. We've done more on civil rights for Jews and African Americans and Asian Americans and immigrants than any of these groups combined, I would go so far as to say. But I have to tell you, there is a radicalism afoot in our country. Again, you're seeing it in certain elections. You're seeing extremists feel emboldened. I mean, we are living in a moment now unlike any in recent memory. And so while we beat this boycott, while the NEA leadership was able to just reject this outright, I am deeply worried because the agitators are again trying to stir up hate. And again, they exploit the pretext of people being, disturbed. And again, as you were speaking about yourself, it's reasonable, it's normal, it's human to be just anguished by the suffering in Gaza or the broader Middle East. Like, that's okay. We're human beings. Compassion, I would hope, is part of everyone's kind of moral makeup. Nothing wrong with that. But to target synagogues or JCCs or Jewish organizations because you're upset about Bibi Netanyahu and how they're prosecuting the war, that's something different. And so we won, and we will keep winning. But that we're even in this fight tells you something about, I think, the motives and the tactics of the other side.
Well, this is a great segue into another conversation I want to have with you, which is about Grok, which is Elon Musk's platform, X's AI chatbot, which recently made several anti-Semitic and Hitler-praising comments. So are social media platforms effectively addressing the proliferation of anti-Semitism, or are they enabling it?
There's no doubt that social media is a super spreader of anti-Semitism. And by the way, as we were discussing earlier, alienation and intolerance of all kinds. I think the net on social media is fairly negative. I don't think it's a very tough equation to solve. And specifically, look, X is a cesspool. You just open it up and don't take my word for it. The things you see on there are extraordinary. I mean, it's just so offensive. Now, look, X or Twitter was never good, but it certainly degraded dramatically in recent years. So I'm not surprised that Grok was pumping out this sort of filth because, if you will, X is the LLM that it's drawing from, right, to form its opinions. Now, the good news is that AI can be taught and it learns. So they took down all the bad posts. It seems that they've adjusted and iterated to improve it. But boy, I mean, not surprised at all. Not enough is being done, not just by X, but by all the platforms. There's been a lot of talk in recent months about the massive investments that OpenAI is making. that Facebook, or sorry, Meta is making, that Alphabet is making, and of course, XAI in their kind of systems, building massive data centers for the compute, investing extraordinary amounts of money in recruiting talent. There was a report in, I think it was Axios last week at the New York Times or the Journal, about the hundreds of millions of dollars that Mark Zuckerberg is offering AI researchers, poaching them from places like Anthropic, OpenAI, like acquiring entire companies. But guess what? They haven't invested nearly enough in fighting hate. I wish that the companies invested the same level of energy, let alone capital, into addressing just indisputably problematic content on their platforms, like they're investing in AI, Gen AI today. If they did that, we'd all be so much safer. Instead, they continue to build, it's like building cars without seatbelts, without hazard lights, without the basics that you need to keep the passengers safe. That's what I would compare the situation to. And I think it's really, really inexcusable.
Couldn't agree more. Let's talk about New York City. I'm sure you have a million thoughts on the Democratic nominee and likely next mayor, Zohran Mamdani. Speak to the concerns that you have about his candidacy and the concerns of many in the city's Jewish community.
So I think New York City is an interesting place in so many ways. It's sort of the commercial center of the United States and really the world. It's the richest urban area just in terms of culture and commerce, as I said. And it's also one of the most diverse cities on the planet. And in fact, it is the city in the world with the largest Jewish population, bigger than Tel Aviv. You have over 1 million Jewish people who live inside New York City itself, between the 5 boroughs. And so the mayoral race is always a hotly contested and, hard fought kind of electoral battle. And in this case, in the primary last month, I think at this point, yeah. Zohran Mamdani came out on top over Eric Adams, who's the incumbent, and Andrew Cuomo, the former governor. So look, I don't have any problem with Zohran Mamdani as a person, but I have a huge problem with Zohran Mamdani on his policies and his ideas. So there was a lot of exposure. There was sort of a spotlight on him, Andy, because he refused to condemn the phrase globalize the Intifada. Now, for your listeners, the Intifada was not like a carnival. The Intifada was not like Woodstock. The Intifada is not like some festival. The Intifada was a series of attacks perpetrated against Israelis and Jews in the diaspora, but mostly Israelis, where over 1,000 people were killed in suicide bombings, in bus explosions, in shootings, in stabbings, in other kinds of murders and acts of gruesome violence. So when you say globalize the Intifada, that was limited to the Middle East and really limited to Israel. Globalize the Intifada is bringing murder and mayhem to capitals around the world. And of course, again, it's being directed not at Israelis, at Jews. Now, directing violence against anyone is unconscionable, but in a world where, as we just talked about, anti-Semitic incidents have skyrocketed, globalize the Intifada is a call to violence. It's an act of incitement against Jews. So Zohran Mamdani wouldn't condemn that phrase. Now, one might ask, if you aspire to be the mayor of the city with the largest Jewish population in the world, why wouldn't you condemn a phrase like that? Here's why. Because he's a hardened ideologue. Zohran Mamdani is not a Democrat in the conventional sense. He's a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, the same organization that has, believes in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against the Jewish state, the same organization that doesn't believe that the Jewish state has a right to exist. And Zohran Mamdani didn't start with the DSA. He started as one of the student organizers of the chapter at his college, Bowdoin College, of Students for Justice in Palestine, the most radical anti-Israel group on college campuses today. The student organization driving the wave of hate against Jews that's exploded since October the 7th. Zoran Mamdani cut his teeth there. Zoran Mamdani's political party, again, doesn't believe in the right of the Jewish state to exist. Now, flash forward, he won't condemn the phrase because he's doctrinaire and he's believes it. But what I'm worried about, Andy, is not the phrase, it's what follows. And I think we should be asking serious questions of him and all the candidates. So, for example, will you provide police protections at synagogues? That's not an unreasonable question to ask. Because again, as I noted in the earlier part of this interview, in Pittsburgh, in Poway, in Colleyville, and let alone in DC or in Boulder, we've seen Jewish institutions, house of worship and other spots attacked. So will he provide police protection at Jewish institutions? We should ask, as all other mayors have done, as all other mayors do in every other city in America. Will he do that? Number one. Number two, we've seen a rise of bullying in classrooms where Jewish students have been targeted. Again, campuses get a lot of attention, but as you mentioned, we had the issue with the NEA, and we've seen a huge spike in anti-Jewish bullying in middle schools and high schools. So, number two, will Zoran Mamdani commit to maintaining an unbiased curriculum in our classrooms? Or will he introduce bias? Will he introduce bigotry into our public schools? That's a reasonable question to ask. Number three, will Zoran Mamdani commit not to appoint extremists and radicals to his own administration? He has a close relationship with people like Linda Sarsour, who's a radical organizer, one of the women who led the Women's March in 2017, who was later exposed for anti-Semitism or extremism. Will Zoran Mamdani commit not to appoint any extremists or radicals to positions in his government? These are all reasonable questions to ask. Will Zoran Mamdani commit to appointing people, irrespective of their faith, to his office? It's very unclear if he's going to do that or not, since he clearly has a bias toward Jews. I mean, one of the ways he's responded to the criticisms, Andy, has been to say, I'm going to increase, I'm going to put more money into hate crime prevention. He believes in defund the police. He's on the record as saying that. So is he now renouncing defund the police? Again, does he continue to support our uniformed people in law enforcement? We just don't know. So I think Mamdani raises lots of questions for police, for small businesses, for law-abiding citizens across the board, and serious questions for Jewish New Yorkers. So I want all the candidates to answer these questions, but he, I think, has a very high bar that he's got to clear if he really wants to make all of his prospective constituents feel safe and trusting based on some of the stuff that he and his party have done in the past.
So with regard to the phrase, globalize the intifada, he met with about 150 top business leaders last week, said he personally would not use the phrase, said he would discourage others from doing so. But as you pointed out, he continues to stop short of an outright condemnation of that phrase. And quite frankly, I don't know if we're going to see him ever get to that point, because I think that just is a core fundamental thing for him.
Can you believe that, by the way? Like, what if someone said, will you say that murder is wrong? Is that hard? Will you say that arson is bad? Is that difficult?
He has a lot of popularity from young people, which I think is great. I think the fact that half his votes came from young folks is a sign that there are young people out there who really want to be engaged. They want to feel energized. They want to get behind a candidate who they feel, speaks to them and the issues that are important to them, like affordability. And all of those things, I think, are terrific, as well as the fact that Mamdani himself is a young man. I have a son his age. I think it's fantastic that, somebody like him and a person of color could be mayor. But I agree with you 100%. His struggle that he needs to address is that so many in his base, so many young people confuse these issues, these phrases, globalize the intifada, from the river to the sea. I mean, we saw that on the college campus protests. To them, there's a contextual meaning to it that's lacking. And so they don't really understand the severity of those statements, the consequence of those statements. And I believe as a politician, he's afraid of alienating those who so vociferously support him in this area. But I'm assuming that what he said last week to these business leaders isn't moving the needle enough for you. And what specifically, what you mentioned the questions that you think he needs to answer, but what specifically do you think he needs to proactively come out and do to assuage the concerns that you have, that those in the Jewish community have, that folks like me might have, in order to expand his base and not keep it at a very small part of the city population?
I mean, there's a lot to unpack in what you said. I would say, so number one, I agree with you that we need young people involved in elections. And I would also agree with you that he ran on issues of affordability. He ran on, free buses and government-run grocery stores and a $30 minimum wage and all these things that sound appealing, although I think in the implementation they will fail.
Sure.
Or whatever. They sound appealing, and especially to young people who like loaded with student debt and AI is churning jobs, especially entry-level jobs, and there's a high degree of economic anxiety among like Gen Z and whatnot. So I appreciate all of that. That being said, I also talked to a number of CEOs who were in that meeting last week. He met within Partnership for New York, like you said, over 100 chief executives. And I did not hear, at least the folks that I connected with, not a single one said they were convinced. They left more worried than they walked in because they said he talked a good game, but didn't give an inch. He's very personable and charismatic, but was oblique at best about what he would plan on doing. So the idea that he won't condemn the phrase, I mean, maybe you're right. Maybe it's because he doesn't want to lose the young voters. Maybe. I think it's also a high probability that's because he believes it. And again, as an ideologue, he's not willing to step back on his principles. And he believes, again, he's an SJP organizer. He believes, and he's a DSA member. So he doesn't believe the Jewish state has the right to exist. And he believes marginalizing and maligning people who believe in the right to state justice, part of his MO. So what does he need to do? Well, again, I think like all the candidates, not just him, and I want to qualify because we're a 501c3. Like we don't get involved in politics or in electoral campaigns. We don't. We may take positions on political issues, but we don't get involved. We're nonpartisan. So I think all the candidates, number one, should be meeting with mainstream Jewish organizations. It has been reported that he's met with some small groups of rabbis. But I don't think when you're the mayor, you get to cherry pick who you meet. You should meet with your constituents, and particularly the representative organizations who they have entrusted with their support. So that could be UJA here in New York. It could be ADL. It could be AJC. It could be the Conference, a bunch of large mainstream Jewish organizations and large mainstream Jewish synagogues, Orthodox, Reform, and everything in conservative, everything in between. So number one, he should meet mainstream Jewish leaders on their own terms rather than cherry picking who he talks to. I think that's number one. Number two, he and all the candidates should clarify where they stand. Will they make commitments to not appoint radicals? Will they make commitments to not interfere with the education system? Will they make commitments to provide protection to all marginalized groups? Will they make other sort of commitments that would assuage the anxieties of Jewish New Yorkers and other people in this great city? He hasn't done any of those things yet, Andy. Maybe he will. But until I see that, until I see him expressing a sincerity to engage with us on our own terms, not on the terms that he sets, but again, meeting his constituents where they are, I think he'll still have a lot of naysayers. And I should say naysayers, but a lot of us will have a great deal of doubt and uncertainty about whether he's actually authentic or he's just, putting on a show in order to get elected. And then when he gets elected, he's going to drive a hardcore, radical ideological agenda. That's what it sort of looks like. Maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. I haven't seen anything yet, though, to demonstrate, to prove me wrong, at least until now.
Yeah, I'd like to give him the benefit of the doubt and say that his motivations aren't driven by an inner desire to see people murdered through a globalized intifada. I prefer to just assume that he's a politician. He's running for office. He's going to do and say things that politicians do and say to appease his coalition, whoever he thinks exists in that coalition. So I'm trying not to look at it as nefarious as some might.
I think we should hold all candidates to the same standard. So think back, as we were discussing earlier on the podcast, about when I started in this job in 2015 and 2016, when Donald Trump was running, and he refused to condemn David Duke, right? And he refused to condemn the white supremacists who were supporting him. People lacerated him for that. And when he was using memes that people found problematic, people lacerated him for that. Hold Mamdani to the same standard. Now, again, I want to be an optimist. I am an optimist. You can't do the job and not be an optimist. So I try to always see the positive, but I think it's fair and principled to hold people to the same standards. And if you were to say to yourself, okay, if his name were Mamdani and he whatever, but if this were like what I saw in 2016, I think we should try to consider him in through the same sort of paradigm. And I think, again, I know where that leads me.
Yeah, I want to be very clear with people who are listening that I think he has to absolutely unequivocally condemn that phrase. He can't pussyfoot around that. And that's going to speak to an authenticity issue, which I think so far is a benefit to him. But the more he skirts around that, the more he is going to have people question his authenticity. But my last question, to sort of up this to a macro level, his victory signals in part an increase in progressive populism in this country and in the Democratic Party. Progressives, as we both know, are generally very critical of Israel. And as we've been talking about, the criticism of Israel also then extends itself to the rise in anti-Semitism and hate crimes and anti-Zionism. How concerned are you by this trend of progressive populism in this country?
I think populism is the concern on both sides. I think populism tends to sort of spring up when the electorate feels like systems are failing, when the institutions they expect to deliver certain things seem unable or unwilling to do so. And so in a world in which, again, cynicism and distrust are on the rise, people don't trust Congress, they don't trust the judiciary, they don't trust law enforcement, they don't trust the media, they don't trust business, and so on. In that environment, oftentimes populists emerge with sort of oversimplified strategies that typically rely on blame and scapegoating the elites, scapegoating the neocons, scapegoating the Zionists, and so on. We've seen this time and again. So I think the rise of populism generally, Andy, is a sign of an unhealthy electorate, if you will. It's a sign of societal dysfunction, whether it comes from the far right or the radical left. And I do think that in light of what we've seen on campuses, what we've seen in our country in the last 2 years, the wave of anti-Semitism, so much of which, not all of it, we talked about Grok a minute ago. I can give you other examples, but so much of what we've seen in the last 2 years is coming from the radical left and from kind of emboldened Islamist movement in this country. The idea that the response to that is to elect someone who comes from like the DSA. And by the way, I should just say, to your point, Mamdani is not the only one. Over the weekend, there was an election in Minneapolis, and Omar Fateh won the primary there. He's a candidate for mayor, vying to replace Jacob Fry, the current incumbent, who's also very radical in his politics. Another leader like Mamdani of the uncommitted movement. Very challenging. So we're going to see more of this unless we get better governance. So that's really what I think we need. We need better elected leaders. We need more inclusive policies. We need this economy to work for everyone. We need opportunity for people up and down the scale. And until we see that, and we need people to, again, reinvest in each other. And until we see these things happen, Andy, I worry that populism will continue to spread, that scapegoating will continue to flourish. And when that happens and conspiracies continue to be like the coin of the realm, we shouldn't be surprised that it gets directed at, unfairly, but directed at the Jewish minority. It happens throughout history. It's happening here now. And we've got to fight that with everything we've got.
Jonathan, as always, appreciate the insights. Looking forward to the next time.
Oh, it's always good to see you, Andy. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Take care.